So a few words of introduction. Thank you very much for having us today. We're presenting the first results of our newest study, which was conducted recently in 2020 by us and another researcher, Professor Przemysław Sadura from University of Warsaw. The research was conducted for Heinrich Böll Stiftung in Poland. So the results and the analysis are based on the study conducted in Poland exclusively. So be noted that the conclusions of our study is somehow limited to our country. And another part why we believe that the study is somehow interesting for not only Polish scholars, but to the international publicity. It's because our country struggles with climate policies. Our government have very obscure and even ambivalent politics towards climate change. Polish society also have struggled with the topic of climate change, if the climate change is a human-induced process, and how we should tackle it. So let's dig in.
Okay, so at the beginning, I would like to share with you some initial thoughts we have, why even tackle climate change and COVID crisis together. And what we thought at the beginning is that there are many similar restrictions between COVID restrictions and climate mitigation measures, especially connected with reducing car traffic and reducing plane travels. So during all the lockdowns among Europe, we basically stopped traveling, we stayed at homes. And there were even some initial claims by scientists and media that it could affect climate. There were some fake news on dolphins in Venetia canals spread around the news and social media. So at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, there was a very small but still light in the tunnel. So we thought, okay, maybe it could be some hope for climate mitigation measures and politics. That's why we decided to take a closer look how this COVID crisis could affect Polish readiness to undertake climatic action and mitigation measures. So if I could please have another slide. So we wanted to show you some data from survey from public survey from Poland, how COVID was perceived throughout the pandemic. So there are two polls from August 2020 and November 2020, and what is worth noting, in August we had very little new cases, and there was virtually no pandemic in the media, so everyone was traveling around the country and we felt as if the pandemic was over, whereas in November 2020 we had the second wave of pandemic and the maximum numbers of cases so far. By then, I mean, we had a third wave already, but by then it was the highest one. And we could observe there were clear differences in the perception of COVID-19 throughout the pandemic. So the reality affected the views. So we could see while while cases grew, also a pandemic was shown as a real threat. And what is important from the perspective of our study, there were clear differences in age. So we could observe differences between younger and older adults and how they perceived COVID and if it was threat to their lives. And it will be important for our results later when we discuss how climate change and mitigation measures are perceived in Poland. Thank you.
So, few remarks about methodology of our study, because our study had 3 stages during which we combine different measurements and different techniques of conducting study. So our initial questions were if the pandemic situation and the lockdowns which were induced in Poland could tell us something about attitudes towards climate change. So if we could see some change and what kind of change we could describe, what kind of change we could observe. And also we wanted to pinpoint if there are differences in population towards climate change and if those differences growth during the pandemic. What were the 3 stages of our study? First was desk research, which was conducted during 2019 and 2020 exclusively. So we used long-term cross-sectional surveys, especially European value studies, European social survey, and also the database of Polish CEBOS. CEBOS is the foundation which have the longest and most complex database of surveys in Poland, Polish exclusive. We also used the survey which was conducted in the April, if I remember correctly, in April 2020 by for the European Climate Foundation. Based on this desk research, we designed 2 next stages of our research. So the second stage and the first stage were conducted together during the November of 2020, so during the peak of second wave of pandemic in Poland. So the second stage was around the making measurements. If the people which we have some focus interviews later on, what were their remarks on first, how do they perceive the climate change, if this threatening their life or not, and second, how positively they are towards the climate policy, which contains some kind of restrictions, some kind of limiting their lifestyle, for instance, travelings or eating meat. So those 2 questions were measured 3 times in the 2 weeks intervals, and the analysis also contains some differences between the younger people and the older people. Those were 2 groups which we interview especially. And also we conducted our research in 2 different locations. In Metropole, it was Warsaw, and in a smaller city, because our desk research shows that there are significant differences between different size of cities, different size of places in climate thinking. The third stage of our study was conducting focus research, focus interviews, and we made 8 interviews total. So our research hypotheses, which were especially important after the desk research, was that the pandemic had a significant impact on climate thinking and climate change, how climate change was perceived by people in Poland. But this influence of a pandemic and lockdown situation was different for especially 2 groups, 2 age groups. For older people, the pandemic was a life threat, very important danger of their life. Therefore, they were more eager to approve certain politics which contain and obstruct their freedom of movement, freedom of consumption. And the second hypothesis, which was formulated for younger people, for people between the age 25 and 34. And for those people, the pandemic was not a life threat itself, but rather a threat to the lifestyle, the very strong and impactful change in their freedom of decision, freedom of movement, etc. So, based on those 2 hypotheses, we try to verify them towards the second and the third stage of our study. So first, let's see the observed generation differences. As I mentioned, the desk research finding that those dynamics were present before the pandemic, that seniors started to be more pro-ecological and they started to perceive the climate change as something threatful, and younger people stagnate. So their views didn't lower before the pandemic. Our surveys, which we conducted in November 2020, falsified the first hypothesis. So the older people didn't improve their views on climate change during the pandemic, during the interviews, and during the free measurements which we conducted. But the second hypothesis about younger people was substantiated. So we found that younger people, after the interviews, after the measurements, lower their readiness to conduct certain actions towards improve climate politics in Poland. Here we have this measurements in diagram. As you could see, the older people have a very similar pattern. For the older people in sense of climate change, so how they perceive it. The second and the third measurement, we can see similar downside. But for the readiness to the taking action, the readiness goes up. Sorry, the legend for this diagram is somehow switched. Sorry for that. For younger people, we could see that both. So the 2 lower is for younger people, 2 up is for older people. For younger people, we can see that both measurements gives us a decrease, both in perceiving the threat of climate change, and also a much stronger decrease in the readiness to taking action. Okay,
Okay, so let me take over. So summing up, we observed there was a difference in readiness to undertake mitigation measures between older people and the younger generation, and as 25 up to 34 years old. So we looked for the reason why, and our idea is to look back into how Poles what they used to think about environment and climate change back in the past, and why environmental concerns, not climate concerns. The easy answer is the climate concerns were not measured back in the 90s and 2000s. So we just assumed climate change is affecting environments, so environmental concerns could tell us something about how Poles feel about climate change back in the past. So what you can see here, back in at the beginning of the 90s, the environmental concerns were pretty high, and they were slowly decreasing all over the 90s up to the 2006. Then we observed a little increase, but it dropped again, and visible increase we observed again in 2016 and 2018, and it was due to reasons like smog actions and other movements, environmental movements in Poland, but we don't have time here to discuss it. So let me move further. What we found as the most important reason for how we feel about climate change and environment in Poland is our history, 90s and transformation, because as you could see during the 90s, we observed a drop in environmental concerns. And what we know from our history, in the 90s, there were changes in industry, many power plants and other plants were closed, and it reduced emissions. Also, there were changes in values, and that's the most important thing to understand how we feel about climate change and environment now in Poland. So, free market and neoliberalism. During the 90s, our society valued very highly their own ability to earn money, their individual properties, and we could observe these values have impact on how they value climate and mitigation measures. Can I ask? Okay, so during our research, we found out that the most valued mitigation measure for people we talked with were free choice and free market measures. So people were against prohibitions, against restrictions. They wouldn't comply for anything that would be banned or restricted. But what they claimed, well, maybe if we increase the prices for certain things like transport, flights, or even food, including meat, they could comply. So their preference was for financial regulations, and we see the clear connection between free market and liberal values from the 90s. I can see we have very little time, so there are just some quotes from our research. We probably can share with you the presentation later on, so you can read it. So Piotr, please conclude.
Okay, so so the conclusions of our research is a little bit, maybe not a little bit, it's quite pessimistic. So our study pinpoint that this free market and liberal orientation is quite common towards not only young but older people, quite commonly. Secondly, there were only two characteristics and two possibilities to support some kind of restrictions, some kind of austerities. The first one was, as Zofia mentioned and as Zofia described, the free market and free market ways of pending the change. So increasing the price, and giving new taxes, etc. But as we can show in Poland, especially, those changes are they didn't change the consumption-orientated work. So the people will have the same consumption as before. The second thing, which was very important in our study, was that the positive reaction to some kind of restriction was only connected with to restricting the activities of others rather than the activities of oneself. So, for instance, the people who didn't fly regularly were more eager to have restrictions on flights. And on the other side, the people who didn't use the coal for heating their own homes, they were more eager to pending some fines for the people who use the coal to heat their homes. So at the very end, to finish and to open the discussion later on, there are two very important things which we could consider. First, the thing of nudging, because as we can see, the politics which were our research shows that the people show some interest in nudging politics as the only way to mitigate the climate action. And the second part is that if we can, based on the individual and free market values, somehow based on transforming towards more pro-ecological action and more pro-ecological preferences. We are skeptical to both, but we will elaborate in the discussion if there will be any questions. So thank you very much for your time, and we hope for a fruitful discussion later on. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk at this conference about some of the findings I have made in my PhD. So as you've heard, I'm an environmental psychologist. So my approach to climate denial is perhaps a little bit different than the majority of perspectives we've heard on this conference so far. So the overarching goals that I try to pursue with my research is to try to find out how do people react to climate change. And there I'm trying to understand denial more from a psychological perspective. So I'm interested in who is it that denies climate change, or who agrees with these like really extreme statements or less extreme statements, and why do people deny? What ultimately is the psychological function behind it? So today I want to talk a little bit about the background and what we know about the psychology of climate change, climate denial, and then about the objectives of my research and what I found. So first word on the psychology of denial. What is denial? So in psychology, we talk about denial as a defensive strategy that we use to protect the self from threat and from the emotional experience. So from uncomfortable, perhaps disturbing emotions that we might feel. And the ultimate goal is to maintain positive self-esteem. So denial is ultimately a defensive mechanism to self-protect and a way to regulate our emotions. And I think that this is really key to understand climate denial from a psychological perspective. Everyday denial, the sort of denial that I'm talking about today, is very complex. We've had this many times in this conference already, and I just want to show how I understand denial in my work. So I follow Cohen's work that he originally did about offenses against human rights. And he distinguishes between literal denial, which means the outright denial of facts, interpretive denial, so the reinterpretation or distortion of facts, and implicatory denial, so the acknowledgement of facts, but the denial of their political or psychological or even moral implications. There is a range of research already on literal and interpretive climate denial, and this research usually finds that people who support or people who hold right-wing ideological convictions also tend to deny climate change, or are more predisposed to agree with statements that represent climate denial. This is ideologies such as social dominance orientation, human dominance over nature, or right-wing authoritarianism. Another predictor that is consistently found is male gender. So it tends to be men that deny climate change more than women. Yeah, and this is a very established finding. But what I've been wondering a bit in my research is there is some evidence that, or there are some claims that climate denial exists on a political spectrum, so that we would have literal and interpretive denial more as phenomenon of the political right, whereas implicatory denial is more phenomenon on the political left. Then we also know that everyday denial is actually changing. So it used to be way more literal. Now it's more implicatory. There's an interesting study by Susanne Stoll-Kleemann, who showed that 20 years ago, people in Germany and in Switzerland used a lot more literal denial to cope with climate change. And now they have moved more to implicatory denial. And she looks specifically at the denial of responsibility and diffusion of responsibility. And we also heard a keynote yesterday that suggests the same trend in the EU Parliament. So generally, I'm wondering, what about implicatory denial? How can we understand implicatory denial? Is this also about protecting loss of privilege, or may this be more an attempt to protect oneself from uncomfortable emotions, or is it both? So in order to understand that, I think we need to look at really more basic psychological theory that explains basic human functioning and defensiveness. And to that end, I look at self-determination theory. That's a humanistic dialectical theory of human motivation, of human functioning. And it basically proposes that we as humans have basic psychological needs that need to be satisfied for us to experience well-being, to be able to cope with threat, in general, to be well-functioning, if you want to use those terms. And this theory also suggests that if these needs are frustrated, then we become defensive. What needs are these? These are needs for relatedness. So that's our need for intimacy, for social relations, for feeling cared for and caring for others. A need for competence. So that means being an actor that has efficacy, that the experience that what I do actually has some sort of effect on the world that I live in, be it my immediate surroundings or the wider world. And the last need is autonomy. That's not independence, but rather our need to make our own decisions, to act from a place of volition, of self-endorsement, of living in line with our values, even though that is very difficult many times. So this theory suggests that when these needs are frustrated, that we become defensive when we encounter threat, because we don't have the psychological resources to deal with this threat. So let's imagine we are confronted with the threat of climate change that has implications ultimately for human survival. That is obviously very threatening, but it also has implications for the social organization of our society. So it's very threatening, and the idea is that when these needs are frustrated, it's easier for us to say, maybe it's not happening, or it might be happening, but it doesn't have to do with me, or I actually cannot change anything, or I don't really have a role in this. So I think this might be an interesting factor to look into to understand implicatory denial. So what exactly did I do in the study that I want to present to you? First of all, I investigated how the spectrum of climate denial, so ranging from literal to interpretive and implicatory denial, how this spectrum relates to established predictors of denial, so right-wing ideology and male gender, but also how it relates to basic psychological need satisfaction and values. I talk about values a little bit later. And secondly, I said that denial from a psychological perspective is an attempt at regulating emotions, at dealing with emotions. So it's relevant to look at other climate relevant emotions, for example, climate anxiety, and look at how climate denial, the spectrum of denial, may relate to anxiety. And I assumed that these relations aren't the same across the spectrum of denial, that on the literal side, when we say climate change doesn't actually exist, or it doesn't have a lot of implications for us, it won't be as severe, then we may not report climate anxiety, because in order to report that, one needs to acknowledge that climate change actually exists and is significant. Whereas implicatory denial might relate differently to climate anxiety, because according to the theory, it should be less successful at numbing the emotional response. So I looked at those two questions, and I want to talk briefly about how I did that. So I conducted an online study last year in July, and I collected data of a bit more than 1,000 people in Germany. This was a quota sample, so it was stratified for age and gender, which means the age and gender distributions in my sample are about representative for the German population. Why Germany? It was convenient for me because I speak German, but also Germany is a really interesting context, because people generally report very positive environmental attitudes. And at the same time, these attitudes don't really relate into climate mitigating behaviors when we look at impactful behaviors. I gave my participants a range of questionnaires that I asked them to fill in. And I just want to present briefly how which questionnaires these were. They were all validated, have previously been used. So the first one is to assess the spectrum of climate denial. I used the climate self-protection scale that I developed some time ago. And this is a scale that really assesses the spectrum of denial. So it looks at implicatory denial. So it looks at avoidance, denial of own responsibility, and rationalization of one's own involvement with the climate crisis, but also assesses interpretive denial. So denying the severity of global outcome severity of climate change, but also personal outcomes. And then for completion, I also added some items on literal denial of climate change, even though we know that this isn't really very common anymore. I used the climate anxiety scale that was developed last year to measure climate anxiety. And I used a range of measures to assess right-wing ideological convictions. So I looked at social dominance orientation, right-wing authoritarianism, and human dominance over nature. I had a measure to assess basic psychological need satisfaction. So here people basically talked about how they felt within the last 3 months. They generally experienced their need satisfaction. So if they were more on the satisfied side or more on the frustrated side or somewhere in between. I also assessed values, as I said previously, and the reason for this is that I did assume, and there is some evidence, that values do relate to right-wing political orientation. So extrinsic values that I'm assessing with this measure are values for success, for financial success, for image, for popularity, and so on. And we know that this relates to right-wing ideology, but also to need satisfaction. So we know that people who strive for these more extrinsic values that are in line with right-wing ideologies tend to be less need satisfied. So they tend to experience more need frustration. So this is in a way a variable that links these different theories. And lastly, I looked at gender. So now I want to present to you my results, and first relations between climate denial and climate anxiety. So what you can see here, first of all, is just a list of the different forms of climate denial, and then climate anxiety at the bottom. So I will just talk you through. We see here that implicatory denial, so avoidance, denial of guilt, and rationalization of one's own involvement, were quite common in the data. So on a Likert scale from 1 to 7, people showed medium agreement, whereas interpretive denial and literal denial were a bit lower. People still agreed with these statements somehow. Some people were quite extreme, but in general, support for these statements was lower. And climate anxiety was very few people reported high climate anxiety or impairment due to climate anxiety in the sample. And here you see some correlations between these, between the different variables. And what I want to point out is that in general, climate anxiety relates negatively with climate denial. But one thing that sticks out is that the relation with avoidance is actually positive. So people who avoid climate change more also report more climate anxiety. And this may be due to the fact that once you experience a very strong emotion and you try to deal with it, you might try to avoid it in your everyday life, but that is a strategy that doesn't actually rid you of the emotional experience once you are confronted with the topic. And I obviously confronted my participants with the topic of climate change and asked them to talk about it. So for the second part, this looks really complex, but I'm also going to talk you through. I ran a structural equation model to look at how my predictors predicted the spectrum of climate denial and climate anxiety. So I looked at gender as a predictor of all of these outcome variables: ideology, values, and need satisfaction. I had enough statistical power to do so. I had to use robust maximum likelihood estimation with Satora-Bentler correction because my data were not normally distributed. But then using this method, this model generally fit the data very well. And I will just take it step by step now to talk about the results. So first of all, literal climate denial. Right-wing ideology was the strongest predictor. If there are no errors here, that means the relations were insignificant. So right-wing ideology was the strongest predictor of literal denial, and a weaker predictor was value orientation. And this is actually a non-expected finding. So this is that people who report less extrinsic value, so less striving for financial success and image and popularity and so on, reported more climate denial, which was a bit surprising. Then we basically find the same for the denial of global outcome severity. So that's a facet of interpretive denial. Very similar finding for a denial of personal outcome severity. So right-wing ideology again is the strongest predictor. Now moving to implicatory denial, the picture becomes a bit more interesting. So again, right-wing ideology is the strongest predictor, but here we also see that male gender above and beyond right-wing ideology explains rationalization. So men tend to rationalize their own involvement with the climate crisis more. And we also see that it's quite weak, but need satisfaction or lack of need satisfaction predicts rationalization. So those who are more frustrated also rationalize their involvement with the climate crisis more. Denial of guilt. Again, right-wing ideology is the strongest predictor. Again, it is men who deny their guilt. So they say, oh, I don't have to have a bad consciousness in relation to climate change. And when what was surprising here was that it was intrinsic values again that predicted denial of guilt. So the less I said that financial success and popularity are important for me, the more I said that I also wasn't guilty for climate change. And there are some potential explanations for this that I can go into later if you want to discuss this. And then again, what was also surprising was that people who reported more need satisfaction also denied their guilt more. So this was in opposition to my hypothesis. Then avoidance, the last type of implicatory denial that I looked at, again, right-wing ideology was by far the strongest predictor. It was women who used the strategy more than men, and it was people who were experiencing need frustration. And then just for sake of completeness, climate anxiety was not at all predicted by ideological conviction, but it was women and people with need frustration who reported most climate anxiety. But we also see here the explained variance is very low. So there are likely a lot of other factors at play here. So what can we take away from this? First of all, right-wing ideological conviction is the strongest predictor across the spectrum of denial. So those who hold right-wing ideological beliefs also deny climate change across the spectrum. So they use all kinds of strategies to say that climate change isn't relevant or is not something that they need to care about. At the same time, absence of need satisfaction or need frustration was a weak predictor, but still an additional predictor of implicatory denial. There were some mixed results, but still the relations were there. So one possible interpretation of this could be that implicatory denial may be both a protection of privilege and a protection from uncomfortable emotions, from experiencing an uncomfortable, disturbing emotion. And then secondly, climate anxiety and climate denial were negatively related except for avoidance. So climate anxiety actually went along with avoidance of climate change in everyday life. And interestingly, male gender predicted denial, whereas female gender predicted anxiety. And this may be an effect of socialization, of how we express and cope with emotions in different ways, or how we're taught to cope with them in different ways. Ultimately, what I want to say is that I think this study adds value in that it gives a glimpse into these really complex relations between climate denial, other emotions and their predictors. But in order to understand this better, we really need longitudinal studies. We need mixed method studies that really disentangle these relations. And with that, thank you for your attention. If you're interested in reading more about this study, then I show you here a link to a preprint. The publication is forthcoming. So feel free to have a look, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion later on. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you to the organizers of this conference for the time and effort you are dedicating to these very important topics regarding the climate crisis, and to all the participants that are bringing their research into this circle. My name is Mayte Moreno-Soldevila, and I will be talking about Androcentrism, Xenoscepticism, and Conservatism within climate change denialism, specifically the case of CLINTEL in the Netherlands. First of all, I will introduce the theoretical framework, including climate change denialism, androcentrism, and conservatism within this denialism, and then I will introduce the Dutch think tank CLINTEL before moving on to the methodology and the results of the study. So as you already know, 97% of climate expert scientists agree on the urgency to take action in order to manage the climate crisis. Nevertheless, conservative political parties, as well as some neoliberal think tanks and other organizations, are arguing against the existence of the climate crisis, the anthropogenic origins of global warming, and the impact of the climate crisis. This climate change counter-movement, or denial machine, is pushing its agenda against the adoption of climate mitigation policies, jeopardizing climate action more and more. This is especially alarming considering that even within climate expert groups, the emphasis isn't always the urgency of the climate crisis. Economists, for example, keep highlighting the need for legislation measures to not damage the free market or the neoliberal system, which relegates the urgency of dealing with the climate crisis itself to a secondary position in the debate. Androcentrism and xenoscepticism have been found to correlate with climate change denialism. Androcentrism is the practice of placing a masculine point of view at the center of one's worldview, culture, or history. In this case, it is relevant to highlight industrial and breadwinner masculinities. Industrial masculinities refer to those who own and operate the means of production and extractivist corporations. For example, fossil fuel executives, bankers, corporate managers, all of which are most commonly embodied by Western white males. Breadwinner masculinities refer to working class men that often carry out those extractive practices. This means that industrial and breadwinner masculinities are hegemonically embodied by mostly men of any social class, and they rely on eco-destructive practices that are profitable. Moreover, racial elements come into play within xenoscepticism and the white male effect. Xenoscepticism is the suspicion or dislike of immigrants combined with a belief that immigration rates are too high, and it can imply outright disdain towards immigrants and asylum seekers. For example, Lockwood points out that right-wing populism depends on what are constructed as nefarious minorities, which are sources of corruption. These nefarious minorities are attributed to immigrants in the contemporary right-wing populisms. Then, regarding racial and gender differences, it is also interesting to look at the white male effect, which refers to the fact that white men usually perceive lower risks related to the climate crisis than women and people of color. Regarding political ideologies, right-wing populisms, nationalism, conservatism, and neoliberalism have been shown to be linked with the climate change counter-movement. Moving on to the think tank CLINTEL, or Climate Intelligence, it is relevant that this think tank was founded very recently, in 2019, by Professor of Geophysics Guus Berghout and the journalist Marcel Krok, and it sustains that there is no climate emergency. Other climate-contrarian European think tanks have been studied, as we saw in some of the presentations yesterday. However, because CLINTEL is so new, there isn't research on it yet. They promoted a There Is No Climate Emergency declaration, which achieved hundreds of signatures worldwide. They have reached political connections within the European Parliament and the Dutch Parliament, especially with the Forum voor Democratie, the FVD. And their discourse seems to be aligned with the main climate denial arguments in Europe and the USA. The methodology I used in this study is discourse analysis, and I applied it on two different levels: the micro level, which includes framing analysis, and the macro level, which includes the gender, racial, and ideological analysis that came up in the theoretical framework. The micro level includes frame analysis, considering framing as the process by which a communication source defines and constructs a political issue or public controversy. And I used the counterframes developed by Almirón et al., which challenge the consensus on anthropogenic climate change. Here on the right, you can see an overview of those counterframes, which include general scientific claims like contesting the IPCC legitimacy, specific scientific claims like denying that climate change is happening, and non-scientific claims like including a neoliberal or a neoconservative economic position, for example. Then regarding the macro level, I connected the previous research on gender, race, and political ideologies, which were related to the climate change counter-movement in the theoretical framework, with the outputs from CLINTEL. In this way, I focused on gender representation and gendered statements, gender quotas and arguments associated with industrial and breadwinner masculinities, and racial and xenoseptic representation and arguments performed by CLINTEL, and the political ideologies connected to this think tank and their climate proposals as well. I analyzed two outputs from CLINTEL. The first one is their World Climate Declaration, There is no climate emergency. This document has been signed by 914 professionals and scholars worldwide, not necessarily climate scientists, but still with a lot of prestige. And it was presented in a press conference hosted by the European Conservatives and Reformists group at the European Parliament. For the analysis, I carried out the frame analysis of this document, which is only 2 pages long, and I identified the gender of the signatories. The second output I analyzed is a video of part of the press conference mentioned earlier. This press conference took place on November 20th of 2019, and it was shared in social media and YouTube by the Global Warming Policy Foundation, another climate denialist think tank that authors like José Antonio Moreno and Núria Almirón have analyzed in their own research. It is important to keep in mind that this video was edited and it is only 5 minutes long, so we do not have the full exchange. In the video, we can see several men from CLINTEL and Irina von Wiese, who is a British politician from the Liberal Democrats Party, and they are having a discussion. Now let's move on to the results of the climate declaration analysis and the press conference analysis. Analyzing the climate declaration, I checked the gender of the signatories using Python to extract all their first names. And then I used an application programming interface that determines the most probable gender of a name. It's called genderdice.io, and it is available for free. The percentage of accuracy of this program, that is, the degree of certainty of the assigned gender, is 97.24%. So we can be 97% sure that this analysis is right in terms of gendering male and females. I did not analyze the racial representation among the signatories because it is not possible to check if the signatories are white or not just by using their name. And it would take a very long time to actually analyze this one by one. The results are that out of 914 signatures, at least 810 signatures are from male people, from men. That is 88% of the sample. 48 signatures are from women, that is 5% of the sample, and 59 signatures are unknown because their first name was absent in the declaration. So I could not identify what their first name was and therefore their gender. So that is roughly 7% of the sample. 88% men, 5% women, and 7% unknown. Therefore, the results on gender variation are consistent with previous research that shows that men are more involved in climate change denialism. Moreover, in terms of frame analysis, these are the frames encountered in the document. So we have frames A1, B6, B7, B9, and C11. A1 contesting the IPCC legitimacy, implicitly or explicitly. It appears in some extracts from CLINTEL's declaration. For example, warming is far slower than predicted, or climate policy relies on inadequate models. Then number B6, it is happening but it is good or it is not bad. It also appears in the form of CO2 is plant food, the basis of all life on Earth. Or saying that global warming has not increased natural disasters. Or saying that the Little Ice Age ended as recently as 1850, and therefore it is no surprise that we now are experiencing a period of warming. So this is obviously showing that they don't attribute this to anthropogenic causes. Then we have B7, which says that it is happening, but it is not us, or it is not only us. And there is an example of this as well. Natural as well as anthropogenic factors cause warming, which is kind of dismissing or putting anthropogenic factors on an equal level to natural factors, when we know that this is not the case. Then number B1, it is happening, but any policy will be worse than warming. It also happens. It also appears in CLINTEL's declaration. CO2 mitigation measures are as damaging as they are costly. And then the last example of CLINTEL's declaration, climate policy must respect scientific and economic realities, would correspond to the frame C11. The text includes a neoliberal or a neoconservative economic position, supporting economic growth as the solution. Then, in the analysis of the European Parliament press conference, I checked the gender and racial representation of the 24 people who appear in the video. Out of these 24 people, there are 8 white men from CLINTEL. In the opposite table, there are 12 white men and 1 white woman. One of these men actively supports CLINTEL in the video as well. And then next to the men from CLINTEL, there is 1 white woman, who is Irina von Wisse, 1 white man, and 1 man of color. Of course, 24 people are too few to consider this a reliable sample. However, I found it interesting that this particular example is consistent with the white male effect that indicates that men are more likely than women and than people of color to not perceive the risks of the climate crisis. In this video, von Wisse is the only person challenging CLINTEL's declaration, and she is accused by these men of being emotional and against facts. Here we have some excerpts from the conversation in which we can see that von Wisse expresses her fear about the impact that CLINTEL's climate change contrarian arguments might have in the development of the climate crisis, worrying that their perspectives shared by others will lead to an irreversible state of environmental disaster. She points out that we do have overwhelming scientific evidence, there is man-made climate emergency today, and denying that it exists today is equivalent to some form of collective manslaughter on another generation. Von Wisse is saying here that the climate emergency is clear, and that if there are no measures taken fast enough to decrease future global warming and mitigate its effects, this will result in the death of many people. This is consistent with the IPCC predictions, which show that if we do not prevent global warming from reaching an increase of 2 degrees or more, this will cause flooding, drought, rising sea levels leading to natural disasters, and damage to the Earth's biodiversity, among others. After von Wisse states these words, the men from CLINTEL looked to one another full of surprise, with open mouths, raising their hands in the air, accompanied with incredulous facial expressions. These expressions and other interjections like "wow" show an interesting dynamic in which von Wisse is very polite, using conciliatory words such as please, I invite you to, or thank you, whereas the men who speak to her are quite rude and interrupt her without using these kinds of conciliatory words and using those kind of rude facial expressions and this kind of wow when she challenges some of the evidence that they are claiming to share. Then we see Berghout's response to von Wisse, in which he tells her that he feels sorry for her because he only hears emotions and not facts. First of all, here we have an example of industrial breadwinner masculinities, which are defined by their opposition to ideas that are considered feminine. Being emotional is here targeted and negatively marked, used in a patronizing and condescending manner by white men towards a white woman. And I'm saying white men because this argument of her being emotional is used by several men in the video. Secondly, in her speech, von Wisse refers to the existence of overwhelming scientific evidence that corroborates we are in an environmental crisis caused by anthropogenic global warming. So his accusation is not truthful. Hence, we see an example of men accusing a woman of not giving facts and patronizing her by accusing her of being emotional. Finally, regarding the political ideology associated with CLINTEL, we can say that they have connections with the Forum for Democratie, the FVD, which is a far-right conservative party that is very actively speaking against immigrants from non-Western countries, which links in with the xenopcepticism we talked about earlier. And Thierry Baudet, the founder of the FVD, regularly quotes CLINTEL's propositions in the House of Representatives. In conclusion, the intersection between gender, race, and political ideology are highly relevant in the climate change counter-movement. CLINTEL is aligned with the nihilist discourses found in other similar think tanks, and it is also aligned in terms of gender and political ideology with previous research on climate change denialism. Of course, the sample of this study was quite small, but I hope it can serve as an example and as encouragement for other scholars to further research this think tank. These are my list of resources, of references. And thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me at mtmoreno-soldevila@gmail.com. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Great. Yes, thanks, Victor, for carrying this panel, and thanks to Jose and Nuria for organizing this fantastic conference and the people at THINKClima. My name is Kjell Vowles. That was the best pronunciation of the name I've had so far, Victor. It's the petrol company, ironically enough. And I'll be presenting two papers here that I've written with Martin Hultman, one that will soon be published in the Nordic Journal of Media Studies, and the other one that's on peer review, but hopefully will be published in a special issue of Australian Feminist Studies. And I'm working at the Chalmers and Center for Climate Change Denialism with Martin Hultman and Christopher Epe and Christer Gille, who are all at this conference as well. So I'll give a short background to authoritarian nationalism in Sweden and to Swedish far-right alternative media. Then I'll present our corpus and methods before moving on to highlight some of our results. So just to give you a few quotes from the Sweden demonstration.
Sorry, I think we are not seeing the presentation correctly because it's stopped in the first slide. So yep. Perhaps if you...
Why is that?
I think it might be because you are using the full screen and it's not supporting it. Sometimes in PowerPoint it happens, but if you want, you can use the interface screen, because we are seeing that.
Does that look better? No.
We are still in the first slide in the PowerPoint interface screen.
I'll see. I'll try to stop sharing and see if I can get it to go.
Okay.
So, see. How does that look? Is that still the file?
Yes, it's perfect now.
Okay.
Thank you.
And did something happen there?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great. So give you a few quotes from the Sweden Democrats, the main party, far-right party in Sweden. And these are from top politicians. Peter Lundgren is a member of the European Parliament, and he claimed 2 years ago that average temperatures have been constant the last 18 years. So that's the sort of hiatus argument from the contrarian climate movement. We have Jimmie Åkesson, the party leader, who in 2018, when Sweden was experiencing unprecedented drought and wildfires in the summer, saying that it's the worst kind of populism to connect politics to climate or to the weather. And then we have Björn Söder, who used to be the parliamentary spokesperson in Sweden, who claimed about Greta Thunberg that she's a vulnerable teenager used by cynical adults and the climate threat is a big hoax. So that's sort of background to our research. And according to the latest Reuters digital news report that came out last year, views on climate change in Sweden is nearly as polarized in the US. And we've got opinion polls in Sweden showing similar trends, not as clearly as the Reuters report, but that the opinions are diverging. So we are looking at the period 2018-2019, when climate change in legacy media peaked. So just to give you two headlines as an example, the first one from Dagens Nyheter, saying that the climate year 2018, there was deadly extreme weather, increasing protest and increasing emissions. And the second one from Aftonbladet saying that, quoting Greta Thunberg, saying, "You know who has created this crisis, hundreds of thousands of youths protesting the world over for the climate." So these years was climate change, especially in 2019, was reported at unprecedented levels. And moving on then to the Swedish right-wing media ecosystem that we've been researching, is that we've been looking at 4 sites. 3 of them are Fria Tider, Samhällsnytt and Nya Tider, who reach between 11% and 6% of the Swedish online population, according to the Reuters digital news report. And none of these have been part of the self-regulatory code of ethics in Sweden. And then the other one being Nyheter Idag, News Today, which reaches 12%, which has signed up to the ethical code. So some take up sort of middle ground between legacy media, established media, and the far-right media. And the far-right media in Sweden has been researched and discussed quite a lot lately, but mainly in regard to anti-immigration and racist discourses, but not so much regarding climate. And to give some background on the right-wing media ecosystem, and this is building on work by Benkler, Fares and Roberts in the book Network Propaganda. And there has been, I think this helps to explain quite a lot of what's going on. In the denial machine, as it was portrayed by Dunlap, there was the idea of the echo chamber, which often has been touted as being run by algorithms. But quite a lot of research, for example, by Jonas Kaiser in the Bernard Voigt anthology that came out in 2019, so that there isn't really an echo chamber, but rather that people actually are getting the news from different sources. So what is happening instead, I think, is that we first have what Bieńkowska et al. Called the reality check dynamics, where actors police each other regarding the truthfulness of content. If a media actor or politician is spreading a fake story, another outlet will call them out. But then we also have the propaganda feedback loop, where actors are policing each other regarding identity, confirmation intent, and ideological content. So the truth isn't the most important thing, it's rather if they're sort of aligned ideologically. And that's what characterizes the far-right media system. And in our corpus, in the sites we studied, the first three that I mentioned, fria tider, samhällsnytt, and nya tider, definitely is part of this right-wing ecosystem. And this is a graph of the articles we collected through the Nordic Press Archive Retriever. So we were collecting all articles that were mentioning climate change or global warming or Greta Thunberg, so in somehow connecting to the topic in 2018 and 2019. And what we can see is that it became an important topic over the 2 years. And in 2019, 4 of the 10 most read articles on Samhällsnytt was actually about Greta Thunberg. But previously, they hardly touched upon the subject. So what we argue in the papers is that the far-right alternative media in Sweden stirred the latent resentment against climate science into an angry hostility against Greta Thunberg and the climate change justice movement. They went from being agnostic about climate change and not writing about it to being antagonistic. And to talk you through a few theoretical concepts, most of these have been highlighted during these 2 days, so I'm not going to talk about them too much. I use Stanley Cohen's schema as well, and just a quote from Cohen saying that the relationship between these types of denials, the relationship to each other is ideological rather than logical, meaning that they can coexist. It's not that it has to be either literal, interpretative, or implicatory. You often find them interchangeably. Interesting with Cohen as well, I think, is that beyond talking about the what of denial, he also talks about the how and sort of who of denial. So it's quite an elaborate scheme. We also used the concepts of industrial breadwinner masculinities or pettier masculinity, developed by Hultman and Pule and Kjell Vowles. The industrial breadwinner masculinities are the ones who have earned the most from extractive industries and include both the fossil fuel CEOs as well as a larger coal-face standard worker who feel that their work and their influence is threatened both by climate change and similarly by feminism. And the working class within this group have often also suffered economic hardship during the last 30 years of neoliberal politics. And then we also used the critical discourse analysis inspired by Norman Fairclough. And what we find then with the scarequoting climate, and this is from the paper that's about to come out, is that literal denial becomes taken for granted background knowledge. The sort of contrarian counter movement is referenced every now and again to provide fodder for the idea that climate change simply isn't a problem, which then is denoted by ionic quotation marks or scare quotes. So in this example, climate problems is within ionic quotation marks. And in this one, we see the so-called climate activist Greta Thunberg. So as climate isn't a problem, you can't be a climate activist, so then they put the so-called in front of it. Worth noting here as well is how scare quoting is a long-favored tactic by the far right, which was noticed already by Viktor Klemperer in The Language of the Third Reich in Second World War Germany. And in present-day far-right discourse, it has been noticed mainly in relation to immigration, but also in relation to climate. And in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats did it in its parliamentary budget in 2016. And here on these sites, it's really become sort of modus operandi, being done over and over again. We also see imagery of climate change hypocrisy on these sites. So this is an article about the former European Commissioner, Jean-Claude Juncker, flying privately. It argues that he flew privately for millions, while also claiming that EU citizens need to be climate smart. And another one being the Swedish Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, next to luxury cars. And what is happening here is that the extreme close-ups of Juncker and Löfven next to the sort of new cars or the luxury air seats is creating the sort of idea of a greedy elite, greedy political elite trying to push climate change on the people. And these images, we argue, also quite resembling sort of the anti-Semitic imagery that was popular in sort of pre-Second World War Europe. We see also the spreading of conspiracy theories and arguing where they try to portray Greta Thunberg as a PR puppet and connecting her to George Soros is one of the ones. And here we see the propaganda feedback loop, clearly how it was first spread in alternate or sort of in social right-wing media, then it was picked up by Nya Tider. And then later on, we found it both in Fria Tider and Samhällsnytt. So it was a story that connected to the ideological biases, and then they could continue to spread it. Climate hysteria, and this ties into a bit what we heard just now about CLINTEL, is how they both portray Greta Thunberg as a mentally ill, sort of manipulated by others, but also argue that she's hysterical or emotional. So this is an article claiming that several reports of concern about Greta has been processed by the social service in Sweden. And similarly about UN Speaks, it says that the last sentence here, several people are scared by her behavior in social media. So the idea then is that it's not her message that is the problem, it's her emotional behavior, and this ties into familiar tropes, emotional femininity against masculine science. And similar tropes were seen against Rachel Carson in the 1960s following the publication of Silent Spring. Similarly, on Fria Tider, they report on a poll about what young people worry about, which shows that young women are more anxious about climate change compared to young men who are more worried about crime. And in the discourse of Fria Tider, this is portrayed that women are irrationally worrying about a non-existent problem, while men are worrying about their own problems such as crime, which in the far-right discourse is obviously related to immigration. There we go. So to tie up, finally, we argue that with the industrial breadwinner typologies that are part of the far right, we feel that there's a sense of ontological insecurity, which has become a breeding ground for the far right. And we know this from studies by Jens Rydgren, that the far right are attacking working class voters. And as noticed by both Benedict Anderson and Erik Homsborn, the historians, nationalism can offer a sense of security in times when everything else seems unstable. Ruth Wodak has written that the vision of the far right is an anachronistic longing for an ethnically homogenous patriarchal society. But we would also like to add the industrial aspect, where immigration is seen to have destroyed the homogenous aspect and feminism the patriarchal one. Climate activism is seen to threaten the industrial pillar. And we'll exemplify this with two quotes that I'll quickly read through to you to try to finish this off. One being, no political leader dare to speak frankly about the catastrophically failed integration of people born abroad and the fatal carbon dioxide fear, the two elephants in the room that more than anything is behind Sweden's decay. And the second one from Nyheter idag is that instead of listening to natural authorities, not seldom so-called white middle-aged cis men, naive decision makers are increasingly listening to a younger generation. Some as young as Greta Thunberg. At the same time, we see headlines about several maternity wards being closed and a shortage of electricity threatening both Stockholm and startup companies. This is all connected. And this, the end there, this is all connected, really shows how they tie these things, three things together: anti-feminism, anti-climate, and anti-immigration. Thanks for listening. I hope you managed to see my presentation. Sorry for the trouble to start with. Thanks.
So hello everybody. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you a lot to the organizers and the scientific committee for giving me the opportunity of being here today. Before starting with the presentation, though, I would like to introduce myself and this research. My name is Mònica Pons, and I'm a pre-doctoral researcher at the Universitat Rovira in Virgili and member of the Center of the Study of Environmental Law in Tarragona. And before starting with the PhD, I studied criminology at the University of Barcelona and an MSc in Transnational Crime, Justice and Security at the University of Glasgow, where I focused on green criminology. So the research I will be presenting today explores the relationship between the revolving doors phenomenon and climate inaction. So to do so, I will start presenting a bit of a conceptual background, the objectives and the methodology that I follow. To begin with the background, I will start with what are the revolving doors, who is engaging in this practice, and which countries are affected. The revolving doors phenomenon is described as the movement of individuals from public office to the private sector and vice versa. It can be understood as a practice that compromises the public interest because the individuals who engage in it can benefit the private companies by passing legislation that favor them in order to secure themselves a position in their wards when they leave public office. The revolving doors phenomenon includes a very long list of politicians going to work for electric companies across Europe or other strategic sectors, such as could be transport or communications. And the politicians who engage in it can be from advisors or less mediatic figures to high-ranking politicians. One last aspect for a bit of a background is that while I will focus solely on Spain, the revolving doors are widespread around Europe, with cases reported in the United Kingdom, in France, in Sweden, in Spain, in Norway, and many other countries. Then the objectives of the research of why it's important to explore the revolving doors, it's three main reasons. The first one is because the research seeks to bring light to this phenomenon within criminology. To do so, it frames it as a form of a state corporate crime, and by doing so and exploring the harms of this phenomenon or associated to this phenomenon, the research is aimed to explore the impact on climate and energy policymaking. Then, the methodology that I used, as I mentioned before, the revolving doors are widespread around Europe, but I will use the case study approach because according to the objectives of the research, this methodology will help to uncover this type of crimes of the powerful that otherwise would remain invisible. Then I will focus on Spain for two main reasons. First, because many of the politicians involved are high-ranking politicians. And second, because this practice is regulated by the Law 3/2015, which establishes a cooling off period of 2 years from leaving public office and starting to a private company or the other way around. Along with it, it also establishes a conflict of interest office to evaluate each case and grant permission. But despite having regulations in place, it has been reported that almost half of the ministers since the return of democracy have gone to work in private corporations, and most of them in the electric and fossil fuel sectors. Now, as I said, I used the case study of the revolving doors between the Spanish government and the electric companies for being the most heavily affected. For instance, last summer, we have seen an ex-president of Catalonia and an ex-minister of Public Works and Transport moving to an electric company. And last week, the General Director of Communications of the largest fossil fuel company, Repsol, who also worked for the electric company Naturgy, previously called Gas Natural, was appointed as Minister of Economy at the new Catalan government. While it is true that some of the individuals involved in cases of revolving doors can have experience on the sector, most of the politicians involved have no previous experience or no knowledge about electric companies or electricity or fossil fuels or anything like that. Even though the public officials who moved to private companies are receiving high lucrative rewards. For example, the total remuneration of the 58 ministers that were board members of the Spanish leading companies in 2016 was 18 million euros annually. So this lack of experience in the sector, along with the high remunerations that they are receiving, leads to questioning if these individuals who are involved in revolving doors are selling their access or their expertise. Okay, now moving to the case study. The interconnectedness among the actors is represented through a network analysis map, which hopefully it will help you to visualize more easily the symbiosis between the state and the corporate sector. Then it is worth noting that the revolving doors phenomenon in Spain mostly affects the leading political parties of the last decades. Even though not exclusively, there are other political parties that are involved, but it largely involves the two leading political parties, which are the two nodes in the bottom here, in the bottom of the picture. Then it also involves the largest transnational electric companies, which are the 5 organization nodes at the top of the figure, and the most influential politicians. If you can read it, you can see here vice presidents, ministers of economy, ministers of the environment, and so on. So in this vein, the two leading political parties most largely involved are the ones representing the two-party system, that it's the People's Party and the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party. Therefore, it's not a thing of right-wing, because left-wing is also involved in this practice. Also, the electric companies involved are the largest transnational corporations belonging to the IBEX 35, which is the Spanish stock market. These are Endesa, Enagas, Red Eléctrica, Naturgy, and Iberdrola by order of appearance in top of the figure. Although the research only focuses on the Spanish scenario, it's also worth acknowledging the transnational reach of the actors involved in this practice. For example, we've seen in the very first note here, Endesa is owned by Enel, which is the largest company in Italy and the one that has more revolving door cases in Italy. For instance, a Spanish former vice president and minister of economy, instead of moving to Endesa, started working for Enel. It gives you the image of the transnational reach, even though it will need way more research to see what are all the transnational connections between countries and inside the European Union and outside, and the institutions, and how can it reach the climate agenda globally. As explained in the definition, the individuals involved can pass laws that benefit the corporations despite attempting against the public interest. Here are 3 examples of the most iconic laws. I'm pretty sure that there are way more of that, but these ones are the very popular ones that affected the electricity sector. So the first one is the law of the electricity sector of 1997. This one privatizes the public assets. It sets 2 private companies to assume the previously public functions and establishes that in the electricity auction, the price that determines the electricity price is the most expensive electricity source, which currently is natural gas. It is true that in Spain there were 2 moments of privatization. The one was the previous to 1997, and the second one was for 1997. So even though the first one was called the silent privatization, it started with a huge disinvestment in public assets. This law, though, was made for assuring the cheapest energy or the cheapest deal possible and environmental protection, we will see that this never happened. And behind this law, we can find some politicians that, after leaving public office, started working in electric companies. To name a few, we find the president and the Minister of Development, who end up working for Endesa, which is one of the two private companies who assumed the public-owned asset, and the Minister of Environment, who started working for Enagas, which is the leading natural gas transmission company. Now, moving to the second law, we find a royal decree. It sets a price on the limit on the price of the electricity, but as the electric companies were privatized, they said that they couldn't be doing that because the real price of the electricity was more expensive than the one that they were setting by law. And the response of the government was to set the known as tariff deficit, which is a plus that Spanish citizens are paying in every bill to give the money back that they say, well, that the government is actually owning to the private companies, but we are making public the money that the government is owning. And similar to the law that I explained before, this one has a huge list of politicians who end up working in electric companies. To name a few, we find the President and Vice President second, the Secretary of Economy and Energy, the Minister of Justice, the General Director of Energy Policy and Mines, the Advisor of the Minister of Science and Technology, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Spokesman, and the Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs. And last but not least, in 2013 was established the popularly known as sun tax or self-generation tax. This one was imposing payments to those who own solar panels, hindering and deterring the Spanish citizens from choosing sustainable energy sources. Along with this, it also cut the subsidies for renewables while maintaining fossil fuel subsidies. And later in 2015, they abolished this tax on self-generation, but the Spanish government implemented a tax on self-consumption, which made the customers of solar energy pay the electric companies for being connected to the electricity grid. Finally, in 2018, this law was modified and abolished. Among these politicians behind this law, we find the cabinet director of the Secretary of State of Energy, who 7 months after leaving the public office, started as Vice Secretary of Red Eléctrica, avoiding completely the 2-year cooling off period. And then the General Secretary of Industry, who 2 weeks after leaving the public office, started as advisor of Enagas. Now, from this legislation is where we can find the harms that can be associated to this practice. We find that they have impacts at socioeconomic and environmental levels. At socioeconomic level, we can find the impact, the increase of the electricity bill, which basically leads the society to energy poverty. Energy poverty is understood as the absence of sufficient choice in accessing adequate, affordable, reliable, high quality, safe, and environmentally benign energy services to support economic and human development. But for example, during the 2008 and 2013 economic crisis, the price of the electricity bill increased by almost 10% each year. On the other side, in terms of environmental impacts, we find the promotion of climate change through policy making. As a result of the cuts of renewable subsidies and maintaining subsidies to fossil fuels, followed by implementing a tax on self-generation and of solar energy, and to protect the profits of the big electricity companies, then moving to the self-consumption of solar energy tax, all of those what generated was deterring the Spanish citizens of using renewable energy sources, and this transition to clean energy sources was being sabotaged. So basically, these policies damage the profitability of transitioning towards renewable energies. Now, even though that I'm presenting socioeconomic and environmental levels, so energy poverty and climate change separately, these are connected, one reinforcing the other. Energy poverty not only impacts on health and democratic principles, it also frustrates environmental protection efforts. As we have seen, privatization meant an increase in the electricity price, which led to fueling energy poverty within the Spanish society. Not only during the 2008-2013 economic crisis, at the beginning of the 2021, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and the storm Filomena, 7 out of 100 Spaniards were estimated to be living in a situation of energy poverty, because the electricity bill increased an average of 18.4% in relation to the same month last year. Consequently, society relied on cheaper energy sources and technologies like butane gas, which its demand increased by 40% that month. In this vein, the energy poverty fulfilled by the laws developed in Spain has a direct impact on climate change by leading us towards the use of less clean but more affordable energy sources and technologies. This increase in demand and use of fossil fuels in turn promotes climate change. Consequently, extreme weather events like we've seen with the storm Filomena or the storm Gloria just before the coronavirus crisis will happen more frequently, leading to more extreme temperatures, increasing not only the electricity bill, but also the need of more electricity, such as heating or air conditioning, entering on a vicious circle between energy poverty and climate change that it's basically promoted through the laws that the revolving doors phenomenon created. Now, I will try to wrap up super quick. Due to the interconnectedness of state and corporation, and to build a bridge between the phenomenon, the case study, and criminology, I use the state corporate crime framework. The state corporate crimes are criminal acts that occur when the interest of the state and the corporation intersect, which is what we can find in this phenomenon. One of the key aspects of this theory is that it is not limited to crimes. The state corporate crime framework includes to its study the harms resulting from the interactions between states and corporations, because it is believed that elite wrongdoings not always involve the floating of criminal laws, as we have seen through the case study, which is only an administrative law. Therefore, we need a harm-based approach to frame this phenomenon within the criminological inquiry. Because leaving the actions out of the illegal spectrum, state corporate crimes are not perceived as serious crimes by the society, even though they are causing injuries, illness, death, financial loss, environmental destruction, or as we've seen through the case study, energy poverty and climate change. State corporate crimes carry with it the invisibility of the crimes that the powerful class commits, but as they mostly break regulatory laws, these greater crimes are perceived as less serious, less harmful, and the perpetrators less criminal. Then, as we could see through the previous sections, the revolving doors are a legal wrongdoing. As the case study illustrates, this practice implies corruption and influence peddling, because politicians use their position and connections with the corporate sector to their own benefit, even though it attempts against the public interest. This practice harms the society, not only at a local or regional level, which could be happening with the energy poverty situation, but also impacts the society as a whole through the promotion of climate change through policy inaction. Now, as a quick conclusion, well, what the research shows is that climate and energy policy making in Spain has been influenced by politicians, now board members of electric companies, without necessarily having experience related to the sector. Also, it highlights the interconnectedness between energy poverty and climate change. The study concludes that the revolving doors phenomenon are a legal wrongdoing that puts the private wealth in front of the public interest, and overall it presents the revolving doors phenomenon as a form of state corporate crime that drives climate inaction. This research has practical and theoretical implications. On the one hand, the practical implications rely on joining the debate about which is the direction that legislation should take. It refers to the harms arising from this practice. They can be avoided through regulation. Maybe they are suggesting putting a cooling off period instead of 2 years or 5 years or 3 years, or who is included in this regulation or who is not, and things like that. And at a theoretical level, this research meets the objective of including the revolving doors as a matter of importance for criminology inquiry, and brings the possibility of exploring the phenomenon through a wider range of case studies through different theoretical frameworks. Okay, so thanks so much. Thanks again for your time. I hope you enjoyed it and that you could follow everything that I was saying. I don't know if it was a bit too crowded, everything. But if you have any question about what we have talked, I will be happy to answer them. And if you need references of what I said, I will be happy to give them to you. And of course, you can always contact me via email or Twitter.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and of course the organization for give me the chance to bring my research here. I'm Eduardo Rodríguez Batista from Universidad de La Laguna. I'm a predoctoral researcher, and I bring you this talk. I begin. Okay, so first of all, well, give me a second. Okay, first of all, I would like to tell you a story which probably of all you know, and it's the story of our planet. A story about habitat loss, about pollution, about marine litter. A story about overexploitation, about climate warming. The story of biodiversity loss. This map talks by itself. So, what are the answers to face this story? Maybe the science museums can play a key role? We'll find out in the next minutes. Let's begin. Let's talk about the new protagonist in the story. Okay, so SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 pandemic situation is undoubtedly tied to the strong connection between nature and society nowadays. This is a natural consequence of the globalized world we live, which has promoted a fast expansion of this disease. On one hand, we all witness the effects our daily life suffer, but what about the environment? While it is true that at the beginning, the reduction in human mobility has caused some positive effects in the environment, that was temporary. Now that things are more settled down, human life continues to be an unsustainable life with nature. Indeed, an article from The Guardian from last year says that soon we'll run the risk of having more max than jellyfish in the Mediterranean. On the other hand, the situation has become a new challenge not only for health system, but also for science communication. So now, more than ever, we should consider the role that a critical approach in scientific dissemination must play. Which one are the consequences of the pandemic in science communication? Well, very quickly, I will focus in a concretely one, because the situation has also been accompanied by an arise phenomenon, fed and promoted by mass media elements. Fake news and social alarm are some dangerous protagonists of the new normality. That's why I will focus in the rising tide of misinformation that we have encountered this last year, because it's very worrying. We have seen polarization in politics and social sphere, more recurrent than ever before, denialism of the existence of an infectious disease like COVID-19, lack of trust in scientific research, social paranoia, and conspiracy theories about vaccines. We have a lot of recent examples adding to the previous one, like the dissemination of denial ideas about climate change promoted by some political lobby and social groups. In fact, misinformation is now considered one of the world's most pressing public health issues by the World Health Organization. So how serious the problem really is, how we can overcome the situation. We will analyze the root cause in the next slides. Because the answer is a phenomenon dormant within society that has been growing in silence between us. And that phenomenon is the post-truth. The modern world is a post-truth world, but what post-truth means? Okay, let's check out the definition given by the Oxford University Press in 2016, whose dictionary has chosen post-truth as the word of the year in that year. Post-truth is defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in sharing public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So in science, post-truth phenomenon is fed and promoted by mass media elements, undermining the trust in scientific evidence in a broad range of the public opinion. In the midst of a pandemic, post-truths contribute to worsen an already sensitive situation, transforming a pandemic into an infodemic as well. I bring you some data. Bernal Triviño and Clares Gavilán classified in 2019 the fake news of the previous year in these categories with these percentages. I will focus in science. As you can see, is 9%, but well, you might think, oh, that's pretty low, but hey, we're talking about 2018, and these percentages probably have changed a lot in the last year with the inclusion of COVID-19 in the equation. Concerning COVID-19 pandemic, in some cases, this has happened regarding the origin and propagation of the coronavirus. For example, during a while, and despite the World Health Organization stating that pets cannot get or transmit coronavirus, persisted a dangerous ignorance that causing pets to be put to their death at worst or sent to already under-pressured animal shelters at best. In medical science, we also have witnessed the emergence of a broad range of groundless practices and misperception about symptoms, diagnosis, and medical treatment. Former President Trump loved this. And for the COVID pandemic or vaccines, such disconnects could become a life or death decisions. At this point, I think we all have a good idea of what post-truth is and implies. So how we could build bridge to sustain a necessary connection between science and society to face the climate crisis and environmental challenges later. We should pursue two aims. First, respond to the changes in society and how they and constantly seek new approaches for the successful diffusion of science, even in crisis situations. And second, foster critical thinking in response to post-truth while providing society with the necessary tools to face it. When I talk, we analyze how we can face these challenges within the Science Museum because it's the topic I'm investigating in my thesis. So when I talk about science museums, I want to clarify that I am talking about any dissemination platforms too, both physical and virtual. In my thesis, I have studied how natural science museums can help us to face environmental challenges. That's why I will show a lot of samples and proposals born in these institutions in the next minutes. So why science museums? The museums are a reference center in educational outreach with a proven capability to raise awareness about the environment. Museums also have the potential to respond to the changes in society and constantly seek new approaches for the successful diffusion of science. But science museums by itself are not enough, or at least the science museum as we know it now. Why? Because a disconnection between science and society exists, a disconnection exacerbated by post-truth. So very quickly, the challenge of science museum and science communication are there, but I don't have time. So I will focus in scientific engagement. And why I focus in scientific engagement? Because it will be the guiding thread in the next minute, and it is a very resource to deal with the problematic of a post-truth world and help us to create a connection between science and society. But being a scientist in an age of misinformation is challenging and often frustrating since misinformation and conspiracy belief are here to stay. In this situation, the Science Museum and the labor that they have been carried out until nowadays is definitely not enough. Museums and science communication need a solid foundation to thrive and survive before a post-truth world. And if we are successful here, we can certainly manage to fulfill the two aims proposed. So what is my proposal? It's the following. Post-truth claims often appeal to emotions, perhaps because the scientific endeavor is traditionally viewed as cold, rational, and dispassionate and objective. We have overlooked the role of emotions in the formation of science opinion and attitudes. But emotion is a fundamental part of almost all human actions and decisions. A better understanding of the role of emotion in science communication can advance how we can communicate and engage public audience to face modern challenges with science. Anyways, scientific engagement must go beyond emotions. Scientific engagement has to transcend and merge with the society to make it better, which implies the necessity of develop critical science to complement emotions. So, our true weapons are both emotion and critical science, or in a few words, critical dissemination and communication of science, or critical outrage. Well, what critical dissemination is? Well, I consider critical dissemination of science as the use of science dissemination as a breeding ground to foster critical thinking and provide society with the necessary tools to do it through a communication strategy. Critical dissemination also presupposes the recognition of our failures as communicators, which are the flaws of science and how we can deal with them to reinvent ourselves and rethink everything with the aim of adapt to what society demands and fit the times we live. So, for a better understanding of the concept of critical dissemination of science, I think it's better to immerse directly into the fields of actions that we can address for the enhancement of scientific outrage, and some examples and proposals based on emotions and the use of narratives to connect science and society. Well, as communicators, we should study and understand our target and potential audience. What are their questions, concerns, and motivation, and provide them through science a place where everyone feels at home, a safe place for better understanding of the world and themselves. Science has to be inclusive, socially objective, and empathetic. We live in an era of abundant scientific information, yet access to information and opportunities for substantive public engagement of science are still inequitably distributed. Even as interest in science communication has grown, minorities and marginalized communities remain largely undervalued in these efforts. Science also has to fight for social action and justice. Museums are no elitist institution anymore. We should overcome the ideological difference of scientists and communicators and recognize historical oppressions, discriminations, and inequities, and center the voices, knowledge, and experience of underrepresented groups also. Hot topics: science for the people, adapt to the change and cope with adversity together. Outbreak exhibition by admission institutions is to be made to the actual times, explains the Ebola crisis and the associated factors to the expansion of this infectious disease, with the aim of teaching visitors about the risks of pandemic and how we can deal with them to minimize the harm. Now, of course, the team is focused in activities about COVID-19, and the focus of the world of this exhibition is slightly different too. Indeed, if you live in Barcelona, you can visit the exhibition temporary in the Natural Science Museum. Related with the last, I would like you to talk about some high-impact temporary exhibitions found on the transdisciplinarity and synergies between art and science. The first of them is after the end of the world. This exhibition proposes a scope where present and future collides, and people can face what is coming in the next year in our Earth, using a large amount of artistic resources to connect with the public. On the other hand, there is this exhibition called Artefacte, very interesting exhibition too that shows some beautiful and impacting photos, but they are not what they seem. Undoubtedly, social media and digital platforms are essential tools to connect with the public too, because transcend the physical space in a virtual space without frontiers. The traffic of information and interaction are relentless in internet, and it's shaping towards what society demands. So in the connected world we live, science cannot forget the social media for promote the insatiability, curiosity to know more, and the content development. Video games and digital narratives, exploring new frontiers through new narrative worlds. No doubt, the potential of stories to stimulate emotions in the audience makes them an excellent emotional communication strategy for science communication. The National Archaeological Museum of Naples is the perfect role model to follow. They created a video game where they allow their player to be a character who goes to the city of Naples. The player can move along 4 temporal axes of the city before reach the museum itself and continues the adventure. And I just want to say one more thing. People love it. People completely love this game. Why can we take these examples into science communication purpose as well? For example, this pretty interesting resource, which is Discovery Tour mode for Assassin's Creed. Maybe we can do something like that in science. It is also possible to apply game design elements and game principles in non-game contests as science museums. How? Through gamification processes. Backward from the Future exhibition is a good example from the Mirai Museum in Tokyo, and propose the question, what will be the condition of Earth 50 years from now? And allows you to imagine the ideal future and what you can do to achieve it. In the modern time we live, people are always looking for the most immersive experience possible. Humans use the 5 senses, and that is what makes us feel alive. Science could be an experience where every single cell of our body is stimulated. One, for example, is a sensory experience within Lisbon Oceanarium that gather together different very human stories about the connection between mankind and the sea through impactful image, music, and dialogues. And I tell you, not suitable for people who suffer from thalassophobia like me. Experience humor as a result of funny science content also increase people's motivation to follow more science on social media and their intentions to share and engage with such content. Carnegie Museum of Natural History, for example, decided to give TikTok a chance. They started to receive thousands and thousands of visits in their publication during the lockdown that last year. And what is their secret? Well, they use objects for the museum collection as fossil and cells and make jokes about them with them as protagonists. Constructive proposals, educate through empathy and awareness. People don't like to feel underestimated, or that's my opinion at least. Rely on just the facts of scientific issues, risks allowing misinformation and misperception to become more prevalent in our information ecosystem and more pervasive too. If we as communicators satisfy an emotion-induced goal, then people are more likely to process information and face the truth. That's why I bring you some examples about how raise awareness is more effective when it's done from an empathy focus. In Mirai Museum again, for example, touch an axe leads a forest to collapse in front of us. In science communication, there are some good references to Smithsonian Institution, through their online magazines, propose a very interesting article trying to change the perception, the distorted and demonized vision of bad that some people has gathered this last year because COVID, through scientific accuracy and humor. And as the author says, bats have had a hard year too. We have to take care of these animals. They are key in some ecosystem because they work as pollinators. And promoting the sustainability of human life and citizen science, the link between frugality and well-being as the key to ecological transition. Denialism phenomenon is intrinsically linked to the field of a possible loss of privilege and well-being, not necessarily a product of ignorance. The most worrying denialism is the one that refuses to talk about solutions and constantly hides behind the perception that this issue doesn't affect our daily life, turning its head and look the other way. The denialism which professes that it's not our fault, but the system's fault. But the aim of promoting environmental awareness and changing attitudes against denialism and climate inaction implies the acquisition of environmental friendly practice. And science communicators should set an example to be followed in that sense. A sustainable lifestyle relies on achieving frugality first. Frugality implies the reduction of mass consumption and the ingenious use of people's belongings. But this life philosophy only produces a feeling of well-being when it is intentionally chosen. In museums, I have a good example. Artifact exhibition explain with different narrative resources the different effects of humans in the environment. In this image here that I bring you, you can see the section dedicated to the waste of water. This panel draws the spectator attention first through the exposition of the difficulties that the lack of water can cause in human life, to finish with some suggestion about what we can do in our daily life to reduce our impact. The little things that make a world of difference. Each and every one of us has a key role to addressing the climate crisis. How we can do it? Unfortunately, I do not have a magic solution, but citizen science projects, for example, have the potential to democratize science by exposing a greater and more diverse section of the population to the scientific processes and environmental friendly practices. If you make people feel protagonist and relevant in their participation within scientific activities, they are more likely to become empathetic and careful with the environment. So, to sum up, how science can bridge in time of post-truth to face the climate crisis and environmental challenges later? Well, scientific commitment is beyond scientific achievement. To help people navigate through the wide world of information that are immersed, science implies strategic communication, critical sense of our role as scientists, and of course, cutting-edge research, but not only in pure science, but also in social sciences, arts, psychology, sociology, etc. To sum up, building connection between all branches of knowledge. Science communication, on the other hand, is the establishment of a conversation between science and the public. Properly focused, emotion and critical science can develop a symbiotic relationship able to build up and share narratives that leads to foster critical thinking in response to post-truth, while at the same time providing society with the necessary tools to take action. So, critical dissemination of science is the result of a strong commitment and consolidated public engagement, and it definitely can help to build bridge between science and society and changing attitudes against denialism and climate inaction, building bridge between science and society through critical dissemination and what that implies. So now that we have this connection between science and society, where are the answers to face the story I told you at the beginning? The answers is a collective effort. A collective effort between the science museums in confluence with other dissemination platforms, a strategic communication in science based in critical outreach, focus on cultivating the critical sense and thinking with a solid scientific foundation and the use of narrative and innovative formats to connect with the public and promote environmental awareness and action. I would like to close this talk with a phrase from Ana Lataya, General Director of Sarriá Museums, that I think it sums up what I have tried to communicate today, and in some way being critical with my field of study. We have to approach the future of museum with an open mind, with an open heart, with courage to get rid of all ideas, to rethink all paradigms, and to imagine and envision something exciting and new. Thank you so much for your attention, and sorry for my English.